We're killing the Kraken.
One does not simply slay the Kraken.
Hello everybody and welcome. Yes, it's finally here, Kerbal Space Program 2. 3.5 years after the first announcement, we can finally get our hands on the game. Well, not quite, this is an early access version, and when the developers say early access, they really mean it. Let's get this right out of the way. The game is far from finished in any sense of the word. We'll talk about that in more detail later in this video. First, I'll give you a tour of the new vehicle assembly building, then we're going to explore normal flight and space flight in KSP2. I'll walk you through a few mission attempts I made in the brief time I had with this game so far, and at the end I'll give you my assessment of Kerbal Space Program 2 Early Access and whether or not you should shell out $50 for it. You can jump around any part of this video using the chapter markers provided by YouTube. Before we start, an important disclaimer. Everything you see in this video is based on a preview build of KSP2. The one you will be downloading will behave differently, the developers are constantly updating, so your mileage may vary. Now that we got that out of the way, let's head into the VAB. It is huge! When I originally heard that the vehicle size will be constrained by the building, I got a little nervous. But it is truly a gigantic building, and I'm pretty sure I could fit something like my Invictus launcher assembly into this shed without any trouble. And you need the space, because you can build multiple vehicles at the same time. That's exactly what you can see here, where I'm working on a Joule 5 vehicle, complete with mothership, lathe, single stage to orbit spaceplane, and lander for Tidal and the other moons. Will it work? Well, we'll get to the explodey bit soon, don't worry. I'm not going to highlight all the new parts, because there are frankly too many of them. New cargo bays, new engines, new structural parts, new tanks. All of this you will figure out pretty quickly. But there's changes in how you work with everything, and since building is one of the most important elements of Kerbal Space Program for me personally, I want to tell you what's what. First, there are no longer two separate tools for rotation and translation. Instead, they put it all into one single thing. It was unusual at first, but after a little while I had no problem working with it. The next button here changes the root part of your current assembly, which is called Anchor in KSP2. And the final button of this segment is the new paint feature. I really like this, because now you can give your vehicles a completely unique look. I already know I'm going to have a lot of fun with this. The next row of icons is the app bar, and it contains something familiar, the engineer's report. It tells you stats about your vehicle, including thrust-to-weight ratio, but only for Kerbin, which is a bit of a bummer, because if you build a lander for Duna or Eve, knowing the values for those would be rather important. I crashed a Mun lander because I chose an underpowered engine and had no indication that it was not up to snuff, because there's nothing in the game yet that would tell me. Next up we come to something that I'm torn about. It's called the Parts Manager, and it replaces all those separate windows when you right-click on a part. It's a bit of a blessing and a curse at the same time. On the plus side, you now have access to all the parts actions from a single place. No more hunting around for a specific part by doing camera yoga to turn on a fuel cell, for instance. Just navigate to electricity, select the fuel cell, and voila! On the other hand, the Parts Manager takes up a huge amount of space. The window cannot be resized, and while playing in my version of the game, it overlaid over other important information, for instance in this case the procedural wings menu. I kinda got used to the thing over the past few days, but I see a lot of discussions ahead in the community whether or not this is the right way to go about things. One more positive. I believe when it comes to console players, this will be an easier way to deal with parts in the game than before in KSP1. One more negative thing though, as it is right now it takes a while to load, as if it needs to rebuild the part tree every time you activate it. Anyway, let's move on. The next item in this so-called app bar is the trip planner. And it's pretty neat. It tells you how much delta V you need to get to any destination in the Kerbal solar system. When you compare it to, say, the transfer window planner mod for KSP1, the new trip planner is better and worse at the same time. It's better because it tells you how much you need for each step of the way and even includes landing and returning when planning a round trip to another moon or planet. It's worse because it only offers Kerbin as the point of origin, which is a bit of a shame because if you plan to do a mission to the gas giant Joule and want to go from one moon to another, this would be very helpful. Or if you are around Duna and want to transfer to Eve or any other planet. Well, the game is still in development, so maybe this will come one day. Right next to the trip planner we have the action group menu. And next to that, the Kerbal Manager, where you can define the crew for your mission. And finally on the right we have our staging menu and Delta V readout. If you want to know the values for each stage, you can press the arrow next to the green button and the game will display them for you. When it works. In my short while with KSP2 this was a bit slow to react and sometimes showed 0 meters per second when in fact it was over 2000 or something. It did correct later though. One other important detail. Game time passes when you are in the VAB. You might notice that the sun is at different levels in each scene I'm presenting to you here. That's because it is wandering across the sky while I spend my time tinkering. The developers told me that this was a deliberate decision made with their sights already set on multiplayer. Remember, we talked about the importance of time sync in multiplayer in a previous video about what problems KSP2 needs to solve for multiplayer to work. What this also means, in my opinion, is that we will definitely need to have an alarm clock feature such as it is already available in KSP1. Nope, nothing of the sort is present in KSP2 right now, and I already see a problem if you're building on a complex vehicle and forget the time you will run into a situation where you miss an important milestone for an active mission. So, before we go and fly around, what's my thought on the new VAB and interface? I really quite like it, to be honest. All the new stuff in the parts catalog makes me want to experiment with what we have here. Really nice things in there, including some new gigantic XL and double XL parts. Also, and I almost forgot this, we now have different fuel types. Methalox for boosters and landers and hydrogen for interplanetary vehicles. This is going to get interesting when we get to the resource production part of KSP2, which will come with the planned colonies update. Alright, that's the VAB. Large enough, interesting new features, new parts that look fantastic, and I managed to get some good vehicles together already. Unless of course I encountered a bug. Or several. More on that later. So, let's go for a ride, shall we? For this I built a little Eurofighter-style dual-engine thing using the new procedural wings. I haven't really talked about those because I'm not really a plane person, but they are fantastic. Really great addition to the game, and I never want to go back to stitching together wing parts that never quite fit. Now to flying. We click launch, and we're already in business. That was real time, no sped up footage. This is a far cry from the loading times of KSP1. While we're flying around, we can see the new Space Center. It is huge, with 4 launch pads, 2 runways and even a boat dock where you can launch sea-based vehicles if you so desire. And while I'm flying around, yeah, we need to talk about performance. I am playing in 1440p resolution with maximum details, because I like eye candy, and I got between 15 and 30 frames in this busy scene on a system with a Ryzen 3900X CPU and an RTX 3090 GPU. In space this shot up to 50 to 60 FPS, but, this is important to keep in mind, neither my CPU or GPU were under full load at any point in time. The CPU bored itself at around 15% and the GPU was around 40 to 50% utilization. The developers weren't kidding when they said there's room for optimization. Also, I've seen some Reddit threads claiming the game was using just single CPU threads. No, as you can see here, that is definitely not the case. It's not using all of the 12 CPU cores I have available, but the load is at least spread across some of them. The developers originally listed an RTX 2060 as the minimum GPU for the game. This has now changed to a 1070 Ti. However, I know from people in the little group that had access to the preview build that they were able to run the game on a GTX 9080 Ti and a Radeon 7970, albeit not super smooth. I promised I will do some performance testing, and I will do this when I have more time, but a quick test on my laptop with integrated Intel UHD 620 graphics resulted in the game launching and then crashing when trying to start a campaign. The log files point to video memory being the bottleneck. So if you have an older graphics card that still has comparatively large VRAM, you might be in luck. As with my previous video, I urge you not to run out and buy a new GPU or complete computer. Watch out for performance reports from various players with different specs to see what's what. Yes, I noticed the drops in frame rates, but for me personally, it's not really a deal breaker. Honestly, outside of first-person shooters and competitive gameplay, I usually don't care about frame rate a lot. I'm used to judging my experience in the original Kerbal Space Program in seconds per frame instead of frames per second. So as long as I get a response to my control input, I am content. Also, I believe 24 to 30 frames per second are sufficient. That's the video creator in me speaking. Here's another plane, namely an SSTO I want to take to lathe one day. In one of the first iterations I didn't use enough struts and, well, it flapped around like a bird. But with one of the next builds it behaved just fine. And the mighty Rapier engines shot me up into space where I did half an orbit and then returned to the Space Center in all its glory. You might have noticed the absence of any re-entry effects. Because they are not yet included, neither is any heating. So right now you could aerobrake on Joule if you so desire without burning up. Reminds me of the really early days of the original Kerbal Space Program when re-entry heat was just a visual effect but didn't do any harm. In fact, a lot of things in KSP2 Early Access remind me of really old KSP. More on that later, including the struts I mentioned. But I imagine you guys also want to see rockets, right? It's called Kerbal Space Program too, after all. Here's an Apollo-style mono-rocket I launched, and this was really cool to be honest. The noises the rocket engines make in KSP2 are fantastic. Engine plumes are also looking great, as do the reflections off of all the parts. I know some people on the forums and Reddit say that KSP1 with mods is visually just as great as KSP2, and after a few days with the game, I can confidently tell you, no. I used the best visual mods I could find for my Invictus mission, and with maybe the exception of the new volumetric clouds mod, it doesn't really come close. Especially when you're talking about the level of detail on the Kerbals and their animation. But yeah, as with any art, this is up to the eye of the beholder, and if you prefer the look of KSP1, hey, you do you. While we fly, we also need to talk about the new user interface and the nav ball. There was a lot of trepidation in the comments when this was first released. After a few days with the game, I can tell you that I really like how the most important information is concentrated all around the nav ball. Having your altitude information right there is great, also having apoapsis and periapsis data on the bottom. Something I would like to see changed is, instead of displaying percentage for the throttle, I would like to see the current thrust to weight ratio displayed here, or have it somewhere else. When performing a difficult landing, this would be very valuable information to have. In KSP1 I relied on the mod Kerbal Engineer Redux to have this, and I used it all the time. What I do not care for in the new UI is the retro pixelated art style used for some elements. While the vehicle parts look realistic and modern, and some parts of the UI do so as well, for instance right there, the nav ball, the indicators for prograde, retrograde, maneuver node, etc. are really crisp. Others have this pixelated look that just feels wrong to me. It looks fuzzy, irritates my eyes, and feels unfinished compared to the rest of the game. Honestly, the first time I saw a toggle switch in this style, I thought, oh, they haven't put the correct assets into the game yet. Also, UI scaling. The aforementioned parts manager from the VAB is also present during flight. As I mentioned earlier, I'm playing in 1440p and this window just takes up too much space. I'm admittedly half blind and can't leave the house without my glasses, but this feels like it's painted in crayons. I want to see what's going on with my vehicle, and too much screen real estate is hogged by this when I have it open. And I do need it from time to time to adjust things. Alright, we're in space, so we want to go to the Moon. The map view has received quite a few upgrades, and we now have these helpful indicators after setting a maneuver plan showing us where the sphere of influence of the Moon begins and where we will enter and exit it. Something you don't see yet is the path across the Moon when focusing on it. This is probably due to me having an early build. This should be available either already in the first early access build or very soon in a coming update. Once we have our maneuver plan set up, we have that information front and center and can warp to it, no matter if we're in the map view or flight view. When you get close to the planned maneuver, the music changes. A Kerbal tells you some warning in Kerbalese? Kerbish? Whatever the language is called, and you get sort of starting lights like at a racetrack. When burning, you now have a new feature. Time warp. Yeah, you can speed up your burn time significantly, and I'm not just talking 4 times physical time warp. Here the vehicle stays on course like in normal time warp in KSP1, but the engine keeps firing. This cuts down the time needed to perform a long interplanetary transfer burn significantly. I already know that I will use this particular feature constantly. It's a massive time saver. And after some trial and error, we got to the surface of the Moon. Yay! Here we have Valentina perform an EVA and plant a flag, and then something happened. I saw an interesting shape in the distance and I decided to investigate. While I did that, it turned out it was just some rocks. I was realizing that I really want to explore more here. I don't really know how they did it, but the developers created the environments in such an interesting way that I always want to know what's behind the next corner. Part of that is the soundscape. It really contributes a lot to make you feel like you're there. The sound design and music in this game is really excellent, and it changes depending on situation. When I tried to land on Duna, tried being the operative word here, the music suddenly was all dramatic like out of an action movie. When you launch, it's all heroic and triumphant. I like this a lot. I even caught myself humming some of the tunes to myself. People might not always consciously register this, but they will feel it and will make them feel more immersed in the game. It did it for me at least. If you have noticed, so far I have shown you the game in a very positive light. That's because I believe there is a spark of greatness there, a diamond in the rough. Unfortunately, the rough part is still very large and needs to be chipped away. During my short stint with the preview version, I encountered dozens of bugs, and so did other creators that already got their hands on the game. As said at the beginning, this is truly early access, really early. Scott Manley put it best a few days ago. The Kraken is alive and well. I had quite a few run-ins with it myself. One time my vehicle lost all control input while Kerbals curiously could be controlled. I had to restart the game and then it was fine. Good thing the loading times are now so much shorter. Once I loaded up a vehicle and it looked like this. And if you remember my Joule 5 assembly from earlier, one time the plane disappeared into the floor after loading up the vehicle. Why? And this is what happened when I tried to launch it. The vehicle completely disintegrated on the launchpad, and after I hit launch just for fun, the roughly 90 vector engines of the first stage roared to life because they thought they were still attached to a fuel tank. They ended up as fireflies in the sky, and the game even showed them draining fuel. Yes, the Kraken truly is alive and well. One of the reasons for vehicles not working as they should is that the developers, inadvertently or deliberately, have made KSP2 to behave similar to KSP1 in one regard. Wobbly rockets. Yeah, you have to use a copious amount of struts again, because there is no auto strut feature. Yet. Me and the other creators who already got access were very vocal about this. Let me know in the comments what you think, auto strut or manual strutting? What's your take on wobbly rockets? Are you so used to it that you don't mind, or do you want them to be finally gone forever? This is what I meant by KSP2 being like early KSP in many aspects. Some features are just not there yet. Again, early access. In many ways, KSP2 was familiar, yet a very new experience for me. Much is the same, but enough is different that you will have to adjust a little when coming from the original game to really enjoy it. That of course is made harder by all the bugs still present in the game. But when it works, oh man, it really works, and I don't want to stop building, flying and exploring. To get a better grasp on where we stand, I put together this little chart of pros and cons. First, the good. We have reduced load times, we have fantastic new visuals for bodies, parts and effects. The new VAB is great with the multiple assemblies feature, the size of it and all the additional functionality. Procedural wings, great. New parts, nice. Kerbal animations, fantastic. The new maneuver plan mechanic is done well. The burn time during warp feature is great and I see myself using that all the time. The overall snappiness of the game is something I really noticed and I really liked. As I already mentioned, the sound design and music. And believe it or not, I know there's a bit of a controversy about the tutorials and the voice used for them. Me personally, I liked it. I was able to listen past the chipper and happy voice in there and just enjoy the content because the content and the details in there are really good and really well produced. So I hope a lot of new players can get to enjoy space a lot more because of that. Now let's get to the bad. Bugs, lots of bugs. This should not be just one item, but like 5. And yeah, it has less features than KSP1. The overall performance is still lacking, even on beefy system, but as I said, the system was not yet completely utilized, so there's room for improvement. I'm not a fan of many of these retro-style UI elements with the pixelated design. The parts manager as it is now, I think it deserves some improvement. And thanks to some features missing, going interplanetary is very hard right now, so new players will have a tough time leaving the sphere of influence of Kerbin. Alright, conclusion time! As I said in my video addressing the performance discussion around KSP2, this truly is early access. It is not a fully polished game yet. Many crucial features are still not integrated, and I'm not talking about things on the roadmap such as colonies, interstellar travel and multiplayer, or even science gathering, but that should not come as a surprise at this point in time. This is something the developers have clearly communicated ahead of the early access release. What they didn't communicate, frankly because they couldn't in such detail, was the state of the game you get on day one. That's where us content creators come in, and I hope I was able to give you a balanced perspective on what's going on. Kerbal Space Program 2 has bugs and some, in my opinion, flawed ways of going about certain things, and at times you will be probably frustrated by all of this. I'm sure some in the community will start to compare this to No Man's Sky and the state it was in when it launched, but that would not be a fair comparison. No Man's Sky overpromised and underdelivered on a massive scale. Features that were announced just weren't there and nobody knew until the game was launched. Not as early access, mind you, but as a full release game. For KSP2 on the other hand, we knew very clearly which of the originally announced features would be in early access and which ones would be coming later, so you can't blame the developers for promising a full product for this launch, because they didn't. But still, the quality of what's there could be better, at least in the build that I have. Maybe the one you have is already better. But they also offer us as a community a chance to control the direction where the game is headed over the next weeks and months. They want honest, constructive feedback to make things better. And no, this is not, hey, they use us as beta testers. Beta testers just test if a feature is working. What we are going to do as a community is give feedback on the fundamentals we see in this iteration of KSP2 Early Access. We might even be able to change some very significant things together. I know that the developers are very receptive to that, and I hope all of us can help cut away that rough part I mentioned earlier so we can get to the shiny diamond that I know is in there somewhere. The asking price is $50 for an unfinished game in early access. As I said last week, you are buying into a promise. A promise that in the coming months the game will grow to fulfill the vision outlined at the beginning, with colonies, with interstellar travel, with multiplayer. And the developers promised frequent updates for the early access release to fix bugs and adjust elements of the game based on our feedback. We're talking a couple of weeks between new versions, at least that's what they told me when I talked to them earlier this week. If you haven't already, please subscribe, I will put out a video with that developer interview soon. For me, the $50 are an investment that will pay off in the future. Certainly more than some of the other investments I attempted over the past few years. You do you, but for me, I have made a decision. Yes, Private Division provided me with the preview version of Kerbal Space Program 2, but I will put my money where my mouth is and I'm going to spend $50 of my own money to own a copy of Kerbal Space Program 2, no strings attached. And yes, even in the state it is in today. Keep in mind, this is the worst it is ever going to be, and I want to be part of the journey that will unleash the potential of this game going forward. So, what are you going to do? Will you also buy into the promise? Will you wait for future updates? Will you wait for a specific feature to go live? Which one is that? Or are you a KSP1 purist that does not want to switch? Again, let me know all your thoughts down in the comments or over on my Discord server, link is in the description. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to my channel for more and follow me on my social thingies, the links are in the description. Thanks for watching, goodbye.